Hey guys, how you doing? Uh, American Populist is just a little bit late, so he'll be hopping in once he gets here. So as you guys may have noticed, this is a a double feature day for me. Uh, my inability to plan is really just at this point almost almost inevitably apparent to anyone who's interacted with me. Saddam Hussein in the chat, he's been the victim of that. But my problem is that I'm a serial overcommitter, and this podcast is no different. It's also difficult when people won't respond for a few days, so it's difficult to tell if something is still on or not. And part of that's most definitely my fault. Like for instance, American Populist and I were supposed to go live yesterday, but in my uh, in my haste to set up a podcast, I forgot that I have friends and a family who probably want to do something on July 4th. So fair enough. And honestly, I had a pretty good holiday. It was very low key, but I went out to my friend's farm, shot a lot of guns, which is always a good time. And I'm just kind of talking a little bit until American Populist gets in. I'm obviously, it's no rush. I've got all evening, but that said, it's interesting. I kind of knew that this wouldn't be a super highly viewed stream, at least live. AA's going live sooner or later. I think Wingle is probably uh, he's probably in AA's chat if I had to guess. Yeah, and I guess John isn't here either. One of the things, Wingle actually might be coming on my channel. We've been talking about that. I think we're gonna try and do a chat. And let me pull up what Wingle and I were talking to. Not on stream, obviously, but I just want to find it so I can quote exactly what I think we're going to talk about. Oh yeah, so we're talking about and that'll be on the 14th. We are going to be talking about a Norwegian author whose name I cannot describe. It's Hamsun, I think is his name. But anyway, that should be really interesting. I don't know very much about him, but I'm excited to talk to Wingle. He's he's here all the time, and he's an interesting enough guy. His YouTube channel, which you know what, let me mute YouTube. His YouTube channel is very good. He has a lot of kind of like deep cuts and cultural artifacts that are really great. Yeah, you guys should go. I mean, all two of you guys should go and subscribe to him because he has just some great deep cuts, like a lot of old folk music and a lot of just cultural artifacts that I really enjoy. I think we have a similar appreciation for folk music, obviously a slightly different tradition. But you know what? I will link his channel in the chat. Hey Oros, glad you're here. So yeah, if you guys haven't seen his stuff, it's well worth your time. And let me write this down because I've started keeping a podcast planner because otherwise I will double book people as I have today. I'm going to be on with Praise of Folly right at 9 tonight to talk about Tolkien, which I'm really excited about. He had a great podcast with Morgoth and Charlemagne and a few other guys talking about Tolkien in the new series, and I'm really excited about it. I think like a lot of people here, I got driven away from mainstream culture by seeing, properties just completely demolished. And I think that in a weird way, Lord of the Rings is kind of the crown jewel of that trend. There's a lot of people want to, a lot of people want rid of that. And so I'm both interested to talk about, Tolkien, the nature of Lord of the Rings, and of kind of, I guess, like European folktale. And then also kind of transition that into a more general conversation about, about talking about like, why are things like this ruined? I'm not big into the whole dialogue of the damn SJWs are ruining our Star Wars because look, at a certain point that becomes kind of masturbatory and not particularly productive. Like, look, I think The Last Jedi is a pretty terrible movie, and I even enjoyed talking about it for a while. But after a while, look, you gotta look around and be like, okay, well, one, there's bigger fish to fry, and two, it's been a while. Other things happen, and so I'm interested to talk about that. I haven't, and this is probably not ideal for talking to somebody who's so knowledgeable. I haven't been through Lord of the Rings in probably 5 or 6 years. I'm going through it again. I have a pretty strenuous reading group. It's been meeting for a few years, and one of my really close friends, who's incredibly intelligent, has basically decreed that we're all going to have to go through it again, because, to quote her, it's the most Christian thing she's ever read other than the Bible. And so I'm kind of excited for that. Like I said, I haven't gone through it recently, but I think The Hobbit was the first ever like chapter book I read as a kid. So that world and Tolkien has a very special place in my heart. And then after that, and this is again going back to me massively overbooking myself, I'm going down to Louisiana to go help a friend out. I'm driving down on Thursday, all 850 miles from where I live in one go. And then we're going to work and see some friends. I won't say who I'm seeing, but I might be seeing some people who are, fairly prominent in these circles in person, which will always be great. Get to go to a Eastern Rite Orthodox church, which for my very waspy Presbyterian self is always quite the experience. They practice full protestation, so there's a point in the service, and I'm gonna, I don't know, and I'm gonna mix this up, but I think it's during some type of confessional. It's also partially in Greek, which makes it difficult for me to pick up what's going on. Everyone in the sanctuary essentially gets down either on their hand, like essentially fully flat on the ground. So, it's an experience. I like the people there. It's kind of a funny mix of, I'm going, to the deep South. It's a funny mix of, Cajuns and Orthodox, which is a very odd cultural mix, but it works better than you think it would. And I'll be helping him out with his place, just getting it ready to move into. And then I will be back, or I'll drive back to Virginia on Monday and probably be absolutely dead for my interview with Heroic Will. And if you guys, Heroic Will obviously came on my channel before, but he has his own channel now, which I'm going to link that as well, which is really great. He personally helped me a ton. So he's a really high-end exercise science and personal trainer. Personal trainer is a very small part of what he actually does. But he's an incredibly gifted man, both like physically, he's in incredible shape, but also he knows a lot about exercise and is very good at expressing that. And he helped me out with my squat form. And I went from really struggling to essentially repping my previous, PB for sets. It just like revolutionized the way I move. And it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I really cannot stress enough how good he is at what he does. And so he has a podcast, and I'll be the first one to, actually I haven't finished the first episode. I've just had so much to do and so much to listen to, but so far it's been great. So I'm going to link that in chat, and you guys should go head over to his channel, because at least currently it's criminally undersubscribed. He really is just a great guy. He also, I think he interviewed Philos. So Philos Miscellany, or however you say that. So if you want to hear him, it's a good place to do it. And you know what? While I'm doing that, I will pin that in chat. Who knows? That might mess up the the regular Jay Burden polls. I was over on Ace's channel after the Thomas stream, and we were talking about social media, and Twitter and YouTube polls kind of work the exact same way for me, which is I put so little thought into what goes out there. It's just like, what's the first mildly amusing thing that pops into my head? And then after that, it's like, oh, well, guess I'm forcing all you guys to see it. So I guess I'll start going into the chat because I don't have too much more to just go on. Apparently, there's an anime PFP in chat. I completely disavow. That might be the only disavowal you'll ever get from me on this channel, but I disavow that. Yeah, Oro's post agreeing that Wingle is great. Yeah, his YouTube channel is. I really just like it. I'm always a sucker for those kind of cultural artifacts on YouTube, and so it's a great collection of those. Yeah, a lot of people excited about Praise of Folly. It is actually saying that he's he can talk for a long time. I completely agree with that, and I'm a-okay with that. I feel like my skill set is have some ideas that are unique, but not that many. I just kind of synthesize other people's work. But I feel like with people like that and people like Thomas, I just like to hear them talk. And if I can kind of lead them along to and obviously I don't need my help, but if I can kind of lead them along to a productive conversation, I feel like I've done my job. So especially with people like that and Thomas, I just shut up because they have such good things to say that I'm just kind of along for the ride. Saddam Hussein, who's I really can't wait to bring him on. I'm excited. I don't know what we're going to talk about, but I'm a-okay with it because Saddam has been a big supporter of mine. And all right, that's American Populist in the chat. I'll bring him in. American Populist, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing, man?
Well, I'm doing well. I was just talking to the chat and explaining to the audience about my inability to run my own schedule, and which I'm sure you've been on the receiving end of this week, right?
Yeah, especially when just random stuff gets in the way that
Well,
I've
it
already
was my
planned
own
for.
fault because I overcommit dramatically, especially with this, because I get kind of ahead of myself, and then I realize, like, wait a minute, I have friends and family, and I'm doing something for the 4th of July, and so can't just talk to someone on the internet while my family's having a 4th of July party, right? But anyway, that's my own fault. So how are you doing, man? I've talked to you a little bit, obviously, in Ace's chat, but I haven't talked to you face on face in a while.
I'm doing pretty good. Working a small time gig at a local ice cream shop and going to college soon, so I'm doing pretty well, I would
Oh,
say.
that's good. I'm still in the neat basement. I'm not completely, like, I was working today. One of my best friends has a house in my small town, and whoever owned the house at one time did the most bizarre things to it. And so we've been kind of slowly just like unruining the house because under that it's a beautiful 110-year-old house. But we found the most baffling thing I've ever seen, and I've worked in construction, I've worked in renovation for a long time. The entire backyard, and I mean the entirety of it, it's like a 2-acre lot, is paved. But it's not just paved, it's paved like 6 inches under the dirt. So the only thing we can assume is that it was paved at one time, and instead of getting rid of it, they just pushed dirt over top of it. And like, whatever, we'll put a lawn over top of it. So he wants to grow things in the back, and I've been out in the back, and I mean, I'm sure right? You're close enough to me geographically. It is miserable hot out right now, and so I've just been sweating like I'm on a chain gang, digging up asphalt 6 inches under the dirt and just cursing whoever put it there.
Yeah, it's pretty hot here in North Carolina. I think it was like 110 or something.
Yeah. It just gets to the point where it doesn't matter how hot it is because I'm not going outside.
Although I'm used to the I'm from Florida, so I'm
Yeah,
used to the
fair enough, right?
humidity.
So I want to have a slightly more specific conversation with you. Obviously, I'd enjoy just talking about work and complaining about the heat. I could do that all day. But this was meant to be a 4th of July conversation, so I kind of want to talk about that. And one of the questions that's been floating around, I feel like the first person I heard it from was a year ago, the Distributist, and then I sent a super chat to Oros and Prude to talk about it, and then Prude talked a lot about it in his AMA, which is basically like, well, okay, we don't like the government. We really don't, and not just like, oh, Joe Biden's in office. Like we have deep problems with, America as a nation, and we're not really represented in that. So do we still, or should we still have to, I guess, celebrate the symbols of that regime? So what do you think about that?
Well, I originally kind of agreed with Distributus that we should like move away from that. We shouldn't be hamstrung by the old meaning of those symbols. But then Prude kind of had an interesting take where he said that the regime is kind of abandoning those symbols and replacing them with their own, like the gay pride flag, for example, or their own holidays like Juneteenth. So I think we can still hold on to them, although we should change the meaning of them to get rid of that the disdain that they've created, associated with those symbols, like the American flag, for fighting for democracy across the whole world, pretty much. So I think we can still salvage them, I would say.
Well, and weirdly enough, it almost helps us that the regime is kind of turning on those symbols, because before I think it was much easier to kind of, because we got to remember, right, that a lot of people aren't super into symbology and super into like the kind of esoteric stuff that you are if you're in our corners of the internet, right? Like most people just aren't that interested. And so if the regime still has power over those symbols and still wants to use them, that kind of hamstrings us, because that kind of takes things, or at least it makes it contested ground. But if those symbols are being abandoned, it's like, well, all right, like people have feelings towards those symbols, positive feelings. So maybe that's a kind of a tool left on the ground for us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like this is just a natural process of the regime kind of abandoning its history because it's already worn it like a skin suit, as Aaron McIntyre likes to say. They wear your culture, your religion, your country, your symbols as a skin suit until it's no longer useful. And so I feel that's what's happening now. They're just replacing what used to be the American flag with the pride flag, pretty much. I mean, and
Well,
you
what
can
I've
name
been
other
interested
symbols as
in
well.
is there's kind of been this like long running joke on the right that the pride flag is becoming more and as having more and more things added to it to the point where it's just completely unreadable garbage. And I know that a couple guys have mentioned this, but I didn't realize that the it's no longer called the pride flag. It's being redesignated as the progress flag. So now they've added, first it was the black and brown stripes for the racial minorities. Then they added the trans triangle. And now they've added, and I'm not quite sure what it's for, but the ones that have the inside of that triangle, they now have a yellow triangle with a purple circle on it. And I think it's for intersex people, that like people with, like, is it not Hansen's disease is leprosy? Is it like Huntington's syndrome? I can't remember. Whatever the term is for hermaphrodites, essentially. So it's been the pride flag even has been subsumed to a new beast, right?
Well, yeah, as they add on new identity groups that need to be part of the imperial regime, as Aaron McIntyre likes to say, which is what the pride flag stands for, the imperial regime that currently governs us, pretty much. And so, as they add on more and more to that, as they get more and more deranged and more insane, they have to add more and more to it. So it just gets comically insane at a certain level. That's why we call it Clown World. But I mean, I think the circle stands for something a lot more disgusting. But I'm not
I
sure
just
if you
looked
want
it
me to
up.
say that.
It was the intersex one. Although I think I know what you're what you're
I mean, I don't
referring
know if you want me to
to.
say that on your channel.
No, I think we're good. I think my days are numbered anyway, but I'd rather not spit in Susan's eye unless I really have to.
Okay, well,
So
you
yeah,
give it a meaning there.
yes, I think I do. The goatsy flag.
Yeah.
The It is interesting though, because I know there was a lot of talk about, like, I can't remember what the name of it, but people basically saying July 4th is canceled, and it really does seem like the two, like the old state religion, of my constitution, my flags, my freedom, that kind of was like the stand-in for Christianity for a lot of the 20th century, is kind of fighting a losing battle against this new state religion. And it's odd because there is kind of a discourse that's like, oh, wokeness is a religion, that I think is a little bit hackneyed, you know? But it is kind of interesting to see that we're almost in a way watching, like a cultural transition to a new form of worship. And just like when, the Christian, the Christians became rulers over an area. They would cast down the old idols, and they'd burn the old temples. It kind of does remind me of what's going on, with monuments and kind of like the old sacred, in quotes, items of the last regime. It does seem kind of like very much post 2013. We've kind of seen a transition, if that makes any sense.
It kind of feels like a little bit of Mao's Cultural Revolution in China, where you get rid of the old symbols of tradition, you replace them with his new communist Chinese symbols to better make the people more loyal to him and his regime. It feels something similar to that, I would say. Although maybe not as
No,
drastic, but
yeah, no, I agree, and I think that is what a lot of the talk about, the struggle sessions has been about. So not to freak you out, but I can tell some horror stories from college. So one of my roommate currently and one of my long term best friends, his family owns the farm that I talk about a lot. He went to one of the public Ivies, right? So not an Ivy, but a very, very prestigious public school. Incredibly difficult to get into. So like a bunch of, he's a smart kid and a lot of smart people went there. And he had, I can't even remember what it was, but it was he was essentially done. It was his last semester. And the course was ostensibly like I can't even remember. It was like a yoga class. Like it was literally he was done, got his degree finished and was like, all right, like I need 3 credits to fill up my schedule. So I'm still full time. Right. And this was when we were still online. So you think like this is essentially a basket weaving course, right? Like nothing to it. But it was kind of during the time of like, it was essentially like the months after Floyd, right? So that was very much in the air. And he has a video of him, and it is very much like the struggle sessions with Mao, essentially being forced to read out this like insane statement about whiteness and the nature of like white centered reality, all this kind of like insane stuff. And we were talking about it, and he's like, look, like I had, like, she literally was like on Zoom, like, if you don't say it, you don't say it to me, I'm going to fail you, essentially, right? But it's that same mechanism, like what would happen in the Cultural Revolution, like what happened to POWs in Korea, right? Where essentially they work you into it. And he's not by any means, like, he's kind of on our side of things. But that's kind of the way they get you, by making you say a lie enough times till it kind of becomes a little bit true, I mean, that's what happens in 1984, right? The way they break Winston is essentially by making him say something that he knows is false, you know?
wait, this is kind of how they propagandize you. Even like people who are more on our side. Like I believe there's this famous like thing where if you write something down on a paper every day, like one thing, like something you don't believe in, that's just insane. Like eventually, if you say it long enough, you'll eventually believe it, and that's kind of what the regime does with this propaganda. It obviously works for the masses, but it could also work on people who are more not mentally, well in the force. You could say, they don't have that strong
Right. No, it's
fortitude.
true. And I think it's actually, uh, and Rod Dreher, again, I like him with qualifiers, but he talks a lot about this in his book, Live Not by Lies, essentially going through kind of the Christian persecutions behind the Iron Curtain. But he does talk about like, there are kind of two ways to deal with like an oppressive totalitarian state like that. There's one which is essentially you just lie and you do whatever they say. And obviously he's against that. But what he talks about is that not only works on more people than you'd think, because essentially you kind of rationalize your own lies, but also it's kind of corrosive to your soul. And so he talks about how, like, especially a lot of Islamic cultures with Sharia law would have essentially two systems of morality. The public facing one where you follow strict Islamic law, and then kind of what happens behind closed doors, you know? And so he said, and I agree with his argument. I wouldn't necessarily I don't have great facts to back it up. I'm remembering a book I read 2 years ago, but he basically talks about how that is kind of personally and societally corrosive, if that makes any sense, like being forced to lie.
Yeah, I would agree, especially when you don't believe something, but like you have to for like this, college class or like you're at your job, and it's required that you could take this woke class from HR, otherwise you're going to be, I don't know, fired, or they're going to dock your pay or something. It's how the regime ensures that you're ideologically committed.
No, you're not wrong. So Minoan in chat saying a Twitter post is going around that the Ivies went from an average GPA of 2.5 to 3.5 from the 50s to today. Grade inflation. That's 100% true. It's been bad for a long time. COVID made it so much worse because the academic standards dropped like a rock. Like, I'll be perfectly honest, I did not, after COVID, I just didn't try because I didn't need to, right? It was just like school got so easy. It was like, what's the point in, putting that much effort in? It's also, especially with more difficult schools, because I did go to a fairly difficult program, and I was kind of exaggerating. I still did have classes that were very, very difficult. But what they tend to do is they tend to, in order to comply with their quotas, what they'll do is they'll essentially create like tiered programs in bigger schools. So for instance, right, like if you look at like an engineering program or a finance program or something like that, that's a lot more difficult. It's not as demographically managed as the rest of the school. And that doesn't mean just white, because obviously there's a ton of hyper-performing Asians in there. But what they'll do is they'll keep those kind of core programs, and it's not everywhere. Those are even now being kind of attacked. But what they'll do is they'll essentially like keep the averages up with other programs, right? So I knew people at UVA, and that's what their kinesiology program is. It's like exercise science. I think they had, when I knew people there, their in-program GPA was like a 3.7 or a 3.8, like crazy high, especially for a difficult school. And what that does is it not only gives you like a storage space for keeping kids that you need to have graduate, but you also can't teach anything difficult to, if that makes any sense. So they've kind of found a way around it, which I'm sure you'll find out when you go to school.
No, I would agree with you. I mean, obviously, the regime kind of has to fudge the numbers for some of the bioluminescent products to get them in there. To prove how diverse and inclusive they are, because a lot of these demographics like can't fill out the standards, so they just lower them in order to compensate, to make it look like, well, because they have to increase the numbers, because otherwise if they cling to the old like actual standards of education, like diversity quotas for in college would go way down to unacceptable levels for the progressive regime, pretty much. So
Well, and it reminds me very much about of this video that the guys at Imperium Press did about woke capital, which is great. It's one of the few videos that I've downloaded on my phone, and I'll watch it, fairly often because it's really that good. And what he talks about is the reason that you see essentially monopolies promoting this. So people like Apple or people who are kind of at a similar level in education, like Harvard, Yale, is essentially if you're pulling from a pool who is kind of, their whole bell curve is shifted left, right? So the average is lower there. That means that there are still ultra high performing people in that group, right? There are, obviously group statistics don't have any bearing on an individual, but there's a whole lot less of them. And if you're at the top of the heap, if you're Harvard, if you're Apple, if you're Google, you have the resources to get those people because you're the biggest, you're the best. But your competitors don't. And so what it essentially is it's kind of a cost-free thing for them to do, right? So they can get the top choices. There's not that many of them. But if you're going to get a job, you're probably going to get a job at Google, or you're probably given the choice, you'd go to Harvard. But the people just behind you, or 2-3 slots behind you, they still have to fill that slot. But if all of the top talent's already picked over, you just essentially tied a weight around their leg. And so that's what I think some of this is, people kind of acting cynically, not to deny that they're definitely like hardcore believers, but I do think part of it is a little bit cynical in that way.
no, I definitely think their motivations are obviously simple. That doesn't mean everybody in those groups who tend to be lower on average. I mean, there's obviously exceptions to the rule. I mean, but again, we're talking about averages here, and so their averages don't prove the progressive regime very well. So I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory in that way.
No, that's well said. So I'm curious, uh, and I think that this is I kind of got I kind of got red pilled in college. You know, I definitely had these leanings before, but it just wasn't something I was that interested in. What is it like kind of being on the more, dissident, the more reactionary side of things and kind of preparing yourself to kind of go into the belly of the beast, as it were?
Well, it's hard because you have to deal with the progressive agenda everywhere. But I mean, I'm very ideologically committed. I mean, as you say, the AA is 10, so I'm a 10 ideologically. I'm not physically yet, but I'm working there. But I'm just like a 10, like so they're not gonna. The propaganda just isn't gonna work for me. I mean, you said there's like I think you said in one of your streams a while back. You said people in our sphere tend to be either very ideologically committed, or they're just very stubborn in that way, more authoritarian in their personality. So that's kind of what I am, I would say.
That's fair enough. It's funny because I was thinking about this because there's like the big five personality traits, which are kind of scientific gobbledygook and also kind of useful just for talking about people you know. And I've heard Charlemagne say this a few times where he says like, look, the difference between me and a conservative is that I'm just as conscientious. I'm just as like kind of naturally hierarchy oriented as a conservative, but I'm really high on openness, right? And I would agree with that classification personally. But I think that that disagreeableness or disagreeability access is also a really important one. Because in my case, like I'm not a particularly aggressive guy, but there are things, and it sounds like you're in the same way, where it's like you're not going to win. Like I will wait you out no matter what. I just flat out won't let you win. Not you really, but the other person. And so that's kind of what happened to me with the vaccine mandate, because my school had announced a vaccine mandate that basically was like, look, if you don't get the vax, we will kick you out. And I just waited him out. I was basically like, all right, fine. Well, I'm going to show up and you're going to have to make me leave. And so finally, like just before the date where they were like, we're going to kick you all out, they're like, all right, fine. We'll give you an exemption, but you've got to go through all these hoops. I'm like, okay, I'll do it. But just like the most malicious compliance you can imagine. And look, I get it. Like the guy doing it is another student who doesn't care. But at the same time, like you brought me here. So I'm gonna make it just as painful for you as this is for me. And so I think we kind of bring it back around. I think that's a good mentality to go into it with, because the bureaucracy in college is insane. Like I'm sure you've seen the graphs about the amount of growth in admin and education is just off the charts, right? It's like I think it's 500 or 600% over the last 40 years, and all of those people want to make your life miserable, especially if you have our opinions. So you just have to essentially, one, be smart about it. Like, look, don't show up in a Black Sun T-shirt because you're probably going to get kicked out. But also just don't back down on certain things. And if you can kind of balance that, kind of like being wise as a serpent and, also being a dove, not being like, walking in and, cold cocking your blue-haired professor in the face, I think you'll be fine.
No, I definitely agree. You need a balance. Like, you obviously aren't going to cave on your principles because we actually hold our principles. We actually have principles, and but you're also not going to make yourself a just like target for the apparatus of the regime just to kick you out. It's like you
One
don't
of the
want to give them
things,
ammunition.
right? Yeah, exactly. Like, don't give them an excuse to kick you out. So one of the things I used to do that was a personally helpful thing, and actually this is the nerdiest thing possible, but I learned this from, I can't remember, some old army manual basically talking about search evasion and like resisting interrogation. But what they basically said was like when you're in a coercive situation for a long time, you essentially have to like keep your own agency. So the example they used, right, is if you're taken out of your cell every day and forced to dig your own mock grave, what they said is that's humiliating. You're being forced to do something else. They're trying to break you down. So what you do is essentially have to do something for you. So what they said is like, we'll view it as, try to like find a flower in the dirt and, put it to one side. And that's like you planted that flower. It's not really what you did, but it's giving you something of your own. And so what I used to do with like essays and stuff that I was forced to write, because my first degree, I went to community college, was a liberal arts degree, and then I got my finance 2 year. Was I would essentially write a completely absurd version of their argument that I know they would lap up, but would be absolutely absurd to anyone else. So, for instance, right, I wrote a paper for my shitlib professor. Essentially, it was like a essentially promoting the Great Replacement theory, but I mean to the point where like it sounds like it was something off of Poll, but because it was couched in the language of essentially the progressive left, she was like, what? Like essentially, she couldn't outflank me on it, so she had to promote it. But it was like crazy stuff. It was like something that like the dreams of Alex Jones are made of. And so I found that as a personally like a fun strategy, like keeping it something that feels like you're doing it for yourself instead of just like lying. Polish ambassador, this sounds like the hetero dog part supremacy experiment. It's very much like that. Like don't be that obvious, but you can actually have a lot of fun with it. And I found that personally enjoyable, and that kind of like puts the ball back in my court, if that makes sense.
No, I definitely agree with you. If you can, like, couch it in their optics while also staying true to your principles, you can get away with a lot that they can't flag you for, and it won't present them with ammunition to, just attack you, present yourself as this, whatever they want to label you as at the current time.
Yeah, it's actually, and this might be slightly controversial. I don't think you should get, not you personally, I don't think people on our side should get involved with campus politics at all. Like, it's just so much the enemy's ground, and the whole system is set up to benefit them. And the likelihood of you meeting that many people who are even close to what we think is pretty low. And maybe I'm overly cynical. Like I know my friend Ace is really involved with campus stuff, so maybe he would give you a different take. But yeah, it was at least from when I was, at community college, like it was a pretty rough battle.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the ground is. I wouldn't say the juice is worth the squeeze there. You're just presenting yourself as a target, and again, a lot of our enemies are there, such as Antifa, and of course, they'll threaten you, and they'll then get away with it because the administrators are going to be on their side. So,
Well, and the thing you really have to worry about. So this is interesting, right? And so I went to this isn't doxing myself. It's a massive school. So I went to Virginia Tech, and we had a big scandal with I think it was our local chapter of TPUSA. Maybe that's not what it's called, but it's supported by the same organization. And what happened was this like new freshman who essentially was ideologically motivated from Nova came in to the group chat kind of with, and this was a not school related group chat. It was just a chat with a couple of the guys, and there was like 6 or 8 of them in there, and kind of like Trojan horsed his way in there, and then got screenshots of them, basically like, oh yeah, can you believe this professor's a fag? Like he's so, like like stuff that guys say, not that offensive, but he took screenshots from that, took it to the news, and took it to admin. Right, created the exact kind of storm you can imagine. And so like all of those, that made me super cynical and super wary, right? Because that wasn't even directly related to what they did on campus, right? But if you associate with those groups, you're kind of like hyper scrutinized, if that makes sense.
no, yeah, I agree with you. I just don't think it's worth it. It gives you a very good target. And obviously, the managerial state in the college is going to be harshly against us and anyone presenting our opinions. And so, if even one of these like double agents or whatever we want to call them, get into a group chat or something, you say something edgy like a gamer word, I mean that's enough.
Right, and you're
to kick
done.
you out.
Yeah. And like I said, and this is so Paul W. Hall in the chat saying some of my like-minded friends were able to take over their college Republican chapter after a few years. Sadly, the neocons took it back after they graduated. That's a pretty common story. That's the other thing. So I like the term barstool conservatism, which basically describes like, the kind of like love America, love my beer, love my boobs, kind of take. And a lot of, and because I did go to a more rural school, and that's a lot of what you see in kind of what's technically like right-wing culture on campus, at least in my experience. It's like that mixed with a little bit of Shapiro in it, and not to say those people are bad people, because like, look, I'm a infamous, defender of the boomer con, so I'm not trying to like purity spiral, but also like that might not be the best place for, you know, to look for friends. Now that said, like I definitely recommend getting like, because I think that like a lot of people like freshman year tends to be rough, like really rough, just socially, but a lot of that is just kind of culture shock, and so I'd recommend just getting involved with like anything you can, really short of that, that's mildly positive, and that'll at least like give you some kind of social safety net, because without one, it's pretty easy to have a miserable time.
No, I definitely agree. I mean, one of the main purposes, besides getting the degree that might be make you some money, is networking and meeting friends. Obviously, you can meet some of your greatest friends from college and stuff. My parents obviously met in college, but they're not a great example because they got divorced. But I mean, you can make it a good time, but it just depends on what kind of effort you put into it and people you talk with.
No, that's fair. And sorry, I'm not trying to just like to speak at you. This is supposed to be some kind of interview, right? So going back to the fourth, I'm I'm always curious kind of what the path of the fourth will be, because there's a part of me that wonders, because in the same way that Juneteenth is kind of being, crammed in as a replacement Father's Day, right? Somewhat ironically, like you notice it's over the same weekend and one gets a whole lot more press. I do wonder if kind of July 4th is kind of like, and I realize it's much, much more deeply buried in the American consciousness, but I do kind of wonder if it's going to turn into Columbus Day, or Robert Lee or Lee Jackson Day or something like that. I do kind of wonder if we're going to see, in much the same way that, everyone laughed when Trump said statues of Jefferson would be coming down. I do kind of wonder if, you know, the number of kind of like widely practiced 4th of Julys is kind of diminishing.
Yeah, I would say it's gonna move in that direction. I mean, it kind of already is. We're seeing this like the city of Tucson a couple of days ago for the force said they weren't going to celebrate it because we based Clarence Thomas overturned Roe v. Wade, to get revenge at Red America. It's just like I think that's pretty much the path for the cities. Although I do think it will live on in Red America, although probably diminishing, sadly, because the path
Yeah,
I see
again,
it
like I
going.
said, I don't have a I don't have like a hard and fast number in my head, but it does seem kind of like that culture is going, is kind of going along the wayside.
The way it's being subverted and replaced with other cultures and kind of colonized by Blue America with like other colleges, for example, moving to red states or just them importing other cultures and replacing them with yours is kind of the sad fate for red America. But so
No,
we
no,
have to
that's
keep
well said.
going.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm kind of curious because, like, having a financial background, there are kind of two markets that I'm always wondering when they're going to crash. And one of them is the auto loan market. And that one's, I think, very likely going to crash soon. Like, I'm not going to get into the data, but it's pretty much like it's like 2008 all over again in that market. But the other one is education, because the price of education is going up dramatically and the quality is going down. And I think that it does kind of become, and obviously there's a whole lot of people invested in keeping that system of debt slavery going, like keeping someone chained to this massive weight around their neck for 20, 30 years. But I'm kind of curious, like, how long can that go on for? It does seem unsustainable, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I think the business model is unsustainable in the long run. However, they keep it going, running long enough because with their uh, other elites from like China or something, that can be serve as a replacement for red American students.
Well, actually, I agree with you. And I also think that there's kind of a racket going on, at least with state schools, because the way that state schools work is that they get funding from the state they're housed in. And attached to that is that they're required to have a certain percentage of in-state students, and those students have a lower tuition. Now, schools lie about this all the time. Like they're always getting busted for it. but they still cheat because they can essentially charge foreign students an absurd amount of money. So essentially, the ratio at my place was like 3 to 1 in cash, and so for these institutions, they will never say no to that. And so I wonder if the limiting principle is just, well, eventually the quality of education in the US is going to go down enough that it's no longer prestigious, that foreign nationals don't want to send their kids here, you know? And maybe that's what kind of causes the whole system to crumble. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball.
Well, I would say as long as the U.S. the U.S. regime is the number one world power, I mean that's rapidly declining. As soon as that status is over, I think that business is going to rapidly decline, and those foreign elite students will rethink going to Yale or Harvard or Virginia Tech or whatever, one of these other Ivy League or other prestigious schools in
I should
America.
clarify. Virginia Tech is most definitely not an Ivy. We're not a bad school, but
No, I just mean like
I'm not that
prestigious
smart.
schools. Like I don't mean
No, I know what you mean.
because I feel
Yeah,
like that's what attracts a lot of them over here. It's just the prestige that America is the number one world power, because obviously that's the reason these Chinese students come over here, because they have
no, definitely.
schools over there, which I'm sure are fine.
Well, and it's odd too because the influx of and the at least the Chinese students, because those are the ones I interacted with the most. It's a very odd segment because in general they're not, and I put this heavily in quotes, they're not like normal Chinese. They're like hyper wealthy. So in my case, right, like Blacksburg, which is where I went to school, is a very small town, and so housing is actually kind of a pain, and it's very expensive for what you get. But there's a whole massive subdivision of houses, like kind of brand new McMansions, and the whole neighborhood's Chinese. And you kind of look down and you realize, wait a minute, there's a Lamborghini there. And it's like rows of essentially like $100,000+, $300,000 cars with houses fully owned by foreign nationals. And what they've essentially done is kind of created this like enclave of ultra wealthy Chinese students, who kind of have their own neighborhood and have their own like area set up. And so it's very, very odd because, at most colleges, right, like it's definitely middle class and upper middle class, but still, I mean, like most people there are fairly normal. Obviously there's rich kids there, but, especially at state schools, it's not the predominant. And then you have, some guy rolling in a brand new Lamborghini, completely dripped out in streetwear, with like a, a watch that's worth more than some people's houses. And you're like, how do you end up here? Right? Like, how did you end up in this tiny little town in like backwoods Virginia? And so I hope that goes away because I don't particularly enjoy that cultural dynamic. It's not pleasant.
No, I think it will go away as soon as the attractiveness and like just the prestige of these degrees just goes down the toilet. I mean, as the U.S. regime declines in world power, which we're gradually seeing, slowly but surely. I mean, the reason to come over here and spend all that money, and go to Harvard and get one of these like garbage dorms and pay like I don't know, it's $2,000 a month or whatever, pay the extremely high out-of-state tuition fees is kind of going to go away. It's going to eat into their business model, I think, a lot.
No, that's well said. I like the idea, and this is just pure fantasy, right? But I do just like love the idea of essentially like using these massive, multi-billion-dollar endowments and just stripping it from these people and using it to, essentially pay off the debt that they've needlessly caused. Because I really, like much like Aaron says, this ends when tanks are rolling over Harvard. And I realize like that's hypothetical, not tanks like that, Roblox tanks. But there is some part of me that's like, wow, I would kind of like to see my my enemies kind of underfoot to a certain degree. Obviously, I'm not like talking about like anything in any way like nasty. Just like I do hate the education system, and I think anyone who went to school, especially over the whole COVID situation, feels very similarly. Like I essentially went to like the University of Phoenix online, right? Like Full Sail University, like something like garbage tier, online education, and paid not full price, because it was essentially paid, the price of going to a real college in person. And it was absolutely extortionate.
Well, yeah, that's what a lot of these colleges do to young people. I mean, They convince them to go to these schools, to go for 4 years or 2 years to get these just useless degrees and get college loans and like just get them in debt. They're already behind already early in their life, can't afford a house, can't start a family, and they've caused a lot of damage they're going to have to pay for, I think.
No, that's well said. And don't get me wrong, like there are certainly exceptions to the rule. Like I know that people at places like, Hillsdale or Grove City have a very different, even Covenant have a very different experience. But I think that broadly speaking, right, like the industry is just rotten to its core and is, kind of responsible for a lot of, I guess, like the worst things going on now, because it really is like the way that people get inculcated into this religion. Like the people who practice it don't reproduce, but they do essentially have control over like the biggest brainwashing machine in America, and they are wielding it like a weapon.
Well, yeah, that's why education means so much to them. That's why they get mad whenever, I don't know, like we ever point out things like critical race theory and we ever make noise about that is just because education is such a source for their um, ideological reproduction because they obviously don't have kids. I mean, the progressive religion, I mean, it disincentivizes having kids. You got climate change, oh, that's not feminist, you shouldn't be submitting to a man in marriage. So the only way they reproduce is either importing or just propagandizing through the education system and through their HR departments to ensure that your loyalty is unquestioned.
Yeah, don't get me started on HR, because if anything will get me kicked off YouTube, it'll be my opinions on HR. So it's interesting. My grandfather, I'm lucky that all of my grandparents are still alive. My paternal grandfather started his career immediately after leaving the military after Vietnam as a school teacher, because it's what his parents did. But he was kind of a school teacher, I guess, when kind of during the 70s, from the early to the mid 70s. And so being in the South, he basically he got to see kind of it firsthand, a lot of those like great society programs kind of come in and just like smash teaching. And he wasn't a long-term teacher. He, was left to do other things and was pretty successful in it. But he just talks about it with this like despair. Because he's like, look, like even then, what, 50 years ago, like it was just impossible to teach well. Like the powers that be essentially just wouldn't let anyone good do their job. And so it was interesting talking to him because he is kind of stuck in the boomercon mentality of it's like, oh, it's the unions, it's the unions. And definitely a big part of it in public education is the unions. But it is odd that education is kind of held up as the sacred cow if you assume the point of education is to produce functional people, because the education system on every level has failed. But if you realize, well, that's not what the system is supposed to do. That's what the system is supposed to do. But it's like the difference between, well, what's the label on the box and what's actually inside of it. And once you kind of look past that layer and you're like, oh, I see why you're doing this. Now I understand why this is a sacred cow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's kind of like those like products that like tell you, oh, it's like, it's full of clean ingredients. Then you look at the ingredients list, it's full of like corn syrup and genetically engineered stuff. And that's kind of what it's for. I mean, it's not what it says on the box, the labels. It's what the ingredient label it says on the ingredient labels that matters ultimately.
Well, and it's yeah, exactly, right? Like you can't, and I think you see this a lot with people. Like this is the core of the very disingenuous argument of, well, if you're an anti-fascist, or if we're anti-fascists, why do you hate me? And you're like, well, okay, I can call myself anything I want, you know, but just by virtue of naming something does not make it so, and so I think that that's really important to kind of keep in mind, because education is held up as held up as this like sacred cow. And look, I'm not saying, no one should know how to read. That's a tact that some have taken, but I don't think I'll go there. But the idea that, we just need to fund education more is kind of laughable, because you can kind of track over time, not even kind of, you just can track, you know, per student spending over time. And it's coincided with a meteoric drop off in results. And so look, if it's correlated, it's all at all, it's negatively correlated, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean,
One of these days, I want to bring on. That's actually the guy I'm going to see, my long term, mentor and friend, George Bagby, because he was a teacher, he was a professor, and he has uh, some of the funniest stories. So he taught as an adjunct professor at a college. I will give no details past that, but he taught essentially freshman composition, and he has a document on his computer of some of the most atrocious work I've ever seen that was presented to him by, freshmen, like people who have got into school, including an entire like 15-page essay about the concept of Robert E. Lee as the Southern genital man. This person misspelled gentle as genital for an entire essay. And it's hilarious to read, right? Like, look, I'm essentially 8 years old, but I find the phrase genital man kind of funny. But you look at it, and on one hand, it's amusing, and on the other hand, you're like, how did you get here, right? Like the system that was designed to filter you out or to teach you to do what you're supposed to has failed. You should not be at this point.
no, I would agree. It has failed at what it was originally designed to do. However, the people who now run it pretty much have just engineered it to serve their needs, and that's all that really matters. The standards and quality of people can be disregarded as long as it's ideologically reproducing the correct kind of people whose
Right.
loyalty will be unquestioned.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like loyalty is essentially the currency of the regime. And it's odd too because I don't know. If you look at kind of the roots of this movement, it was very like education forward, but also like it focused on excellence, if that makes sense. So look, like I'm not the biggest fan of like the kind of New England Puritan focus on education, but you also kind of have to look at them and said, well, at least they were good at what they wanted to do. Like there's a part of me that's like, I don't agree with you. I don't like this culture, but it was a stringent culture. And I think that there's this kind of flippant response to people who believe in hierarchy, where they're like, "Oh, well, you're not a 6'10", ultra muscled giga chad with 140 IQ. Therefore, why do you believe in hierarchy?" And I don't know. At least I look around and I'm like, I'd like the people over top of me to be more competent than I am. Like if we have a choice, like if I look at people, and I don't think I'm particularly intelligent, like I'm probably like what, one standard deviation above average. I'm not going to quantify it, but I don't know. I would like for the people who have kind of control over my life and death to maybe be, better off than I am. I'm not even saying they have to be perfect, just even kind of like a baseline level of competence. And I think that's where a lot of the like rage and resentment towards our regime comes from. That the people in charge, it's not that they're, at least in my mind, I don't think people are really mad like that they don't have a say in who's in charge. I think that they're mad that people in charge are bad at it, if that makes sense.
No, I mean I would agree. I mean you're just seeing the incompetence of the regime just increase tenfold. I mean as the decline in the elites has just been very obvious to us. I mean with the gas prices and like food shortages and stuff. I mean this would be unthinkable in the '90s. I mean the competency of the elites even back in the '90s was this wouldn't even have happened. I mean they would have managed the gas prices and like food supply chains way better. But of course, with the ideological commitment and furthering of the regime, the competency of them goes down as well. So we're just like seeing the price of that right now, I think.
Well, and this is a good metaphor for both the regime in toto and also your experience in college. So I think it's the king pilled guys. I'm not 100% sure, but it was on Pete Quinones, and he basically said that you have to look at the regime like a 30-foot tall baby with a chainsaw, right? Like it's not particularly smart, it's not particularly delicate, but if you make it mad, it'll destroy you. So the game is you're just waiting it out. You're waiting for it to get tired. You're waiting for it to find something else to do. You're waiting for it to fall down, and drop the chainsaw or whatever. And then you can do something about it. But if your reaction is to walk up, puff up your chest and kind of say, all right, I challenge you to fisticuffs, then you're going to get just turned into a smear on the ground.
I mean, yeah, I would agree.
So I'm curious, right? Because we kind of have, I'm probably like 4 or 5 years ahead of you. And so I went through school at a different time. What was it like going through high school with all of the like COVID stuff and then, St. Floyd and all of that? Because I was in college and, kind of a little bit less connected to my institution then.
Well, it wasn't great. I mean, the decline was just obvious even there. I mean, the education. I mean, education quotes because most of it was how racist your history is, how awful your ancestors are, whitey. Look how much you've oppressed people. World War One was caused by these white people, and I mean, that's pretty much can be boiled down my education. The only thing valuable I probably learned in my high school was like how to manage my credit score in my economics class, and that's probably the only useful information I got. So
Yeah, the real lie there is assuming that Serbians are white. I've probably made some Balkan incredibly angry saying that, but obviously a joke. It's yeah, it's interesting. So I was pretty lucky. I had to go to a private high school, but I went through during Trump, which was its own big shakeup. And largely it was a conservative crowd, so people were pretty happy with it. But I kind of got to see, at least personally, the anti-Trump, like never Trumpers split off because they were distinctly in the minority. But watching that split and watching the kind of like Bill Kristol types get wrapped back into the Democratic Party was really odd to see. Like we were talking about it on Ace streams, right? But like Bill Kristol talking about how and it's so stupid, right? How July 4th is not an America First holiday. And look, I realize that's both a message that has a lot of weight or has a lot of meaning behind it, but it is just kind of hilarious. Like, well, the holiday about America is not about America. We have to talk about other countries before the country we're celebrating. And so it's funny to see that kind of like splinter group. We're kind of seeing the Trotskyists return to whence they came.
I mean, yeah, this is kind of something we're also seeing with like the anti SJW like leftists. Like, I mean, Distributus recently had an example of this when he was like had this thing with Adam and Stitch, where like they were supposedly on our side because they were anti this progressive woke stuff. But as soon as we actually get a right wing victory, then they instantly go back to the Democratic Party. And I think that just shows you kind of.
And I'm deeply personally embarrassed to admit this, but there was probably like a 3 or 4 month period where I watched their stuff because Sitch used to do decent like media analysis. So I had subscribed to him for that. And then kind of when he first started doing the political live streams, but it was very apparent to me pretty quickly that he was just a snake, and at least for me, like I'm not just personality wise that interested in like, internet blood sports, like yelling. I think most debates are kind of a waste of time. But for me, it's kind of like I just kind of developed a bad taste in my mouth and didn't think about it. So it's kind of this weird throwback to see them, kind of all over the side of the internet, because it was kind of like the seeds I saw as kind of like, oh, I don't like that. That kind of soured me. In the time that I hadn't been paying attention had grown to just an absurd level, right? And it was kind of like like the disease had progressed to a terminal state. And I was like, what happened to you? Like I never, not to say he was ever great, but it was kind of like, it was absurd.
Yeah, he used to have actually like interesting ideas, and he would actually listen and entertain them. I mean, just like 4 years ago, he was on Distributus, like actually entertaining some of his ideas. But now it's just like it's uninteresting, like set in stone, kind of shit lib, But we're anti SJW, but it's like that was just always a facade. Like they're just embarrassed liberals, but they're always going to be loyal to the left. I mean, there's temporary embarrassment, but they'll go back as soon as there's a right wing victory, because that means the right is actually gaining, and they want to be on the winning side.
Right. Yeah, and that's I think is a big part of it, that they want to win, and also I think a lot of it is just sour grapes over not being at the top of the heap anymore. So like, oh, and you see this with James Lindsay, right? Like James Lindsay was to a certain extent the darling child of like the last instantiation of liberalism, right? Like he's an atheist, rationalist, professor. So if this is like 2004, he's the best there could be, really. And then the kind of the criteria shift, and he's off. He's in a subservient position, and it seems like in a lot of cases he's more mad about that than anything else. So it's just kind of a acute case of Hose being mad.
No, yeah, he's just mad that they aren't giving him the same attention because they moved on to diversity and gay marriage is their top issue. I mean, he's kind of just left in the dust. I mean, he's not the spokesperson or one of their most highly sought after classes of people, preaching the good word of progressivism anymore. And so that's why he's just like supposedly on our side, because he's just angry that and bitter that he's not at the top of their movement anymore. Is highly respected by them.
No, that's well said. So I'm going to cut things a little short because, as I'm sure you've noticed, I have a double header tonight. But do you have anything you want to plug before we get out of here?
Just like subscribe to my channel. I mean, I'm making more content. I have a couple more interviews coming up. I have another one with Nolis coming up. We're going to discuss Hungary's role in the Eastern Front in World War II. It's going to be very interesting. Lots of people liked my interview with Nolis last time, so I'm bringing him back. I'm also making some more edited videos, which are coming up, just taking me some time. But just subscribe to my channel. Check out my Twitter if you want to message me. I'm pretty open.
And I can confirm the episode with Oros is great. Oros is a great friend of mine, and he's always got interesting things to say. And I don't know how to say this, but he's been kind of like feeling out and talking a lot about kind of making our own communities. And I feel like he's someone to keep an eye on because it feels like he's right on the edge of coming up with something really good. Not to say that he hasn't before, but just like he's one to watch. So if you guys for some reason haven't heard of him, I definitely recommend keeping your eyes on Oros Post. He's one of our best. So anyway, I'll plug my stuff. Obviously, subscribe to the channel. I've got a bunch more interviews coming up. Like I said, I've got Thomas on Thursday. I've got Praise of Folly on later tonight. And if you guys think this interview is worth anything, I have a coffee link down in the description, and I'd really appreciate it. Even just $1, it means a lot to me. But anyway, guys, I'll see you all later. Thanks for coming out. Goodbye.